group-seeking site called Consult Dr. A. Some of you may know his voice really well from his NPlex reviews, and if you don't already know his voice well from those, you will. He is former chief of IV services for Bastyr Oncology Research Center and a past professor at Bastyr University, where he continues to consult in research design and holds the rank of full professor. But that's all boring, you already know that. So I trolled on his Facebook page while I was in environmental medicine today. And you put this on public domain, so I don't feel that bad about sharing it. But he has these points about his life that I'm going to share with you. You can decide if these are real or not. And I'll just start there. So point A, he has had his skull crushed. Point B, he has been trampled by cattle. Point C, he has spoken personally to Hubert Humphrey on the campaign trail. Point D, he has been held at gunpoint more than once. Point E, he has been stabbed. Have you sought medical attention for all of these things?
I'm not looking at them so they can't see.
Okay, your reaction. Which one's real, which one's not? Okay, yeah, I'll distract you.
I'm being neutral.
Okay. He's almost died a few times prior to the age of 1 month. He had an extremely rare and unique correspondence with President Nixon prior to his resignation. Most of us weren't alive for that, I'm just saying. He has, sorry, to be quite fair. He has talked his way out of an assassination attempt on himself. I don't care about that one. He has testified before the federal government committees. He has a learning disability. He has been shot at more than once. He once spent most of a night talking a CIA operative out of a PTSD episode that he might have caused. He may have, on occasion, saved some lives. It's my favorite. He was attacked and almost eaten by a pack of dogs. His father saved him. He watched the very first episode of Sesame Street, which did not gain any acclaim in rural Oregon. He worked in a cadaver lab. At the time, a newer, safer alternative to formaldehyde preserved them. This new formula was found to be so toxic and cancer-causing that if you had even one constituent and spilled at your facility, the EPA would close it until remediated. And he literally maintained it for 5 years. He attributes this to excellent cytochromes. And concurrently, he worked in a lab where they would use an electron beam vaporization of a chemical that is actually anti-carcinogenic. And they worked with over 100 in that lab that were carcinogenic. And later in life, he worked with the MD PhD who discovered said cancer therapy. It is not used in the US right now to treat cancer currently. Which of those are false?
None.
Maybe I should hand the microphone over to you. Which of those are false?
They're actually all true. I can make up the false. So, yeah, I wasn't expecting that, but that's way better than my bio. At a certain point, you just realize that you are supposed to still be here. Honestly, people try and kill you enough times, and you just know that you're going to die. You're going to die. You can't change that shit. So, I'm assuming this is all part of why you're here. I want to thank Bastyr actually for not letting us have this at the school, which is what I wanted. Because I was there all day, most of you, and I thought, well, it'd be a shorter commute. I could just walk somewhere and do this, but because of the commercial thing, they didn't do it. But then I realized we were at a bar and there's all this food, and Priority One was going to pay for it anyway, and so we can say whatever we want. So
Thank you, Priority One.
I don't think we could have pulled off this food at Bastyr. No. So there you go. It's all good. All right. I do thank you for coming at the end of the day, because it's the end of my day partly as well, and I know how it feels. I know you all went to class today, and I know that I said similar things to 4 different groups throughout the day, although the last group I will tell you about You really,
It's my group.
someone created some PTSD in me, and I went deep. Yeah, it was amazing in the last group there. So you don't know what's going to happen tonight. When I get tired, it's on. So what I want to talk about tonight, I've got enough water to do it, I think. A couple of things. This is actually water.
Is it?
The people next door do have potato vodka, but I don't have any right now, so, but I will have that. On the table over there, this is a little pre-flyer for the Cancer Therapies book that Mark and I wrote. Mark and I were contemporaries at what we used to call NCNM, and which is now NUNM, so I guess I went there, whatever you want to call it. And we put, just so you know about the book, and this is not about the book, people have asked, we wrote it really to patients and families, but we referenced it like a textbook. Our publisher publishes things like for EPOC and all these other highfalutin medical people who don't reference anything, okay? We turned in a book with about 1,100 references. They were less than jazzed. They were like, well, we thought you guys were kind of like EPOC and, you know, it's all out there. And we're like, yeah, but people are going to take this book to their doctor and they're going to say, well, that's all bullshit. And, you know, so it literally has 1,100, I think short, maybe by 5 references, so 1,100. The reason that we did that is and I had to be bridled in, so there's 2 of us writing. Mark has only written to the public. I have only written to doctors over my career, pretty much. So I had to rewrite a lot of stuff so that the families and patients would understand what the fuck I was talking about. And yet we reference as much as we possibly could. So whatever piece the patient takes in, the doctor says there's no research, they can just look. And they may not buy it, but at least they see there's research there. So it was a labor, at this moment, a labor of love. Not made any money. But it's coming out, I think, in about a month is when they're in production right now. So if you have friends or anybody who wants to look it up, there's a shortcut to it. They're on the table over there by our sponsor who bought your food. And apparently there was a bar too, so there you go. I love sponsors who have bars. I didn't know that was going to happen either. So, because I want to go to the bar, I want to get to talk about this. For those who listen to all of the talk about cancer today, we have a super upper. You know, important stuff. It gets a little bit of a downer by the end of the day. Less people die from this. This is a slower death, and it's a lot happier story. So, the title of Biofilms, what does the last $200 million in research taught us, is there's a little bit of poetic license. It's more than $200 million, but that was a nice even number. And here's a couple of things. When I was in school, no one talked about biofilms because everyone thought that the only place in humans they existed was on your teeth, and they weren't really a problem. And we knew that they existed in oceanography, so that was kind of why would we worry about them in people. Then, in the last number of decades, what we've seen is a lot of antibiotic resistance, microbial resistance. You know, I've been doing this with patients with chronic infections and things for 3 decades now, and I promise you, even if you weren't alive to meet Hubert Humphrey or Richard Nixon, that's back there, people. Not that long ago, it was a lot easier to get people to not have infections. Not that long ago. Infections are not only becoming super infections, but resistant strategies like biofilms. Biofilms sort of, it's a good poster child for resistant strategies. They're trying to survive the microbes like we are. The problem is that they're in us, okay? And another problem is that there's this compounding effect that they have that I'll get to a little bit later that makes them work in teams. So it's bad enough to have Pseudomonas, or it's bad enough to have a protozoal infection, it's bad enough to have whatever that won't die when you try and kill it. But when you put them together, you can't even predict what they're going to do. And the biofilm facilitates this. Now, this whole thing about all the research is an interesting story, and I can tell you a little bit of it, because that's really all you care about anyway. About 7 years ago, I noticed this trend where my chronic infection patients, even with the best well-rounded care and everything, were just taking longer and longer and longer to get better. And we're still doing it, but it was like, man, why is it taking all this effort to get these people better? And then, lab testing has improved a lot in the last 30 years, and so now we can kind of follow it into follow before. It's like, why are these infections just, in some people, you can't break them? They will not lead to mucous membrane. And so I started to, at the request of a patient, who I think, this is one of these patients that comes in your life, and she would periodically just sort of throw something out at me and say, have you looked into this? Because she knew that I did research and other stuff. And so one of her, have you looked into biofilms? And I said, yeah, I did, and I kind of couldn't get anywhere with it because the state of the art was not very good, and I don't know what anyone's been doing, in that area. And she said, well, I think there's been stuff going on since the last time you checked, and you might want to look. And I said, that would make a lot of sense, because she knew what kind of practice I had and all that, and with the people who didn't have cancer had infections that wouldn't clear, or were really hard to clear. So I started to embark on, and this was during probably about, 5, 6 years ago or so, maybe a little bit more, time flies. I started to embark on what we like to call medical practice or human experimentation, whichever way you like to look at it. Because I had all these patients that weren't getting better, and if patients trust you, it's a two-edged sword, because you can do whatever you want pretty much, but also you have a lot of responsibility there. So I would go and say, we're going to try this, usually. And they would say either okay, or well, you haven't killed me yet, or why, good question. And I would say, well, that infections we can't get rid of, we're going to try and see if we can work some way in there and get your immune system in touch with the thing. Okay, and so we would go on. And I would try different stuff. Now, one of the things I think, after hearing my bio 4 times today, it sounds like I do, is IVs and other stuff like that. So initially I thought, well, most of the biofilms are probably systemic, which they can be, and they are, and there's pathological proof of that. So it seemed to me that going intravenously with biofilm therapies would be a much bigger reaction, we would get a faster punch and bigger immune response. What a slide that's coming up later will tell you is that actually didn't happen. Now, that is not to say that we didn't get some traction with IV therapies like IV antibiotics and natural IV anti-infectives and all that. We would see changes when we did the biofilm therapies with them intravenously. But it was when I got to the next step that we started to do some of that, but a lot more oral stuff. Okay? Now, it kind of makes sense. If you think about it, in humans, the first place we found it was in dental biofilms. And then they started to buy into the idea that, well, if they're there, we should look elsewhere. It turns out we have natural biofilms in our body. So the first thing that you want to think about as we talk about biofilms is it's like microbes in your GI tract. They're not all bad, right? Some are bad, but some are normal. So there's a spectrum. And the first end of the spectrum is normal biofilms that we all have. We've had those since there have been people. Those are not the problem. Then it turns out, and this is something that was new to me as I was researching, and there was not real good language around it, so to make it simple to people to grab onto in their brains, I named them. And I named them in 2 phases. So there's phase 1, pathogenic biofilm, and phase 2. The reason that I named them that way comes from the research, but what it basically shows is there are both preventive and therapeutic things that you can do that cover a certain end of the spectrum of pathogenic biofilms, so they're beyond our natural ones that are good for us. They're pathological, and those things work to a point, and then they kind of stop working. And so it seemed to me that there might be 2 steps or 2 phases, and so that's what I settled on for naming. At about this time, I was also, some of the IV stuff I was working on was really aimed at these harder, higher level biofilms, but it was largely all IV stuff, because most of the oral stuff did not understand or address the deeper, harder, better built biofilms. And that wasn't because they were trying not to address them, it was because the state of the art of what we knew until very recently, we only understood the first step, okay, as far as pathogenic biofilm. So then what many of the younger generation learned was there were particular things that were used for biofilms, and everything that's a biofilm is the same thing. And so people then started to teach others, which is, again, if you predate this, you wouldn't even know it, but they started to teach other people, well, so there are certain things that treat biofilms. What they were teaching was, these are things that are for the first phase of pathogenic biofilms. They work good for prevention or treatment. Important part about it is it's a continuum that goes both ways. So while we don't want to kill every biofilm in the person, just like we don't want to kill every good bug in your gut, we want to prevent, if we can, biofilm formation. And so you think about it, and other than modern times, and we're more toxic and all those other reasons why we're sicker than we used to be, native diets of anywhere in the world, look at a native diet, and it will have something, usually from a plant, that is naturally occurring in that diet all the time. And it's usually not one thing, it's usually a number of things that are anti-biofilm. So if you're eating the native diet and you're getting, good bacteria and all that stuff, you have natural prevention against biofilms progressing. If, on the other hand, you tend to go to our, kind of new world sterilized diet that we eat in North America primarily, and there aren't a lot of these native things, which I'll tell you about, you could set up a syndrome where your normal biofilm levels then are a little bit too friendly to the wrong bugs. And so wrong bugs move in, kind of create a new biofilm community, and they just slowly kind of take over pathogenically. You can still use these agents to kind of help break those down, and those are some of the traditional things. And I'll go through all this. I really think it's good to understand the arc of this story, because there's something that people will miss. And you're all too smart to miss it, so you're going to hear it. And that is that, yes, there's a point where most of the things you've heard that work for biofilms quit working. This is what most of the money the government, U.S. government, has been spending on biofilm research that almost nobody in the world knows is going on, has been researching. Because they know there's this crossover point where the normal preventive / treatment things quit working. And this is where bad illness occurs in phase 2. The reason this became so important is you see this in battlefield wounds, military applications. But what everyone knows, who knows such things, but doesn't want anyone else to know, is if you go to the hospital for anything, an IV, a surgery, anything, you leave with super biofilm creating stuff. And especially if you have surgery. This is well known. nobody wants that to get out. Okay? So it takes microbial resistance to a whole much more bad level. So all of this money being spent, and it's being spent to cover this second phase of biofilms, which are really, really bad. And the idea being, they will have patented means, numbers of patented means, to defeat biofilms at needle insertion sites, surgery sites, inside your body, outside your body. You'll be given all this, and it'll all be done while you're in the hospital, and no one will tell you why they're doing it. They're just going to do it, okay? So, let's say there was some magic in the world, and the phase 2 biofilms, which are worse, could be slowly chipped away at and broken in, right? You don't need to treat them forever. It's sort of like you shouldn't need to treat most infections forever, right? Once you get the biofilm broken open, you get the immune system reacquainted with the bugs that are in there, they will start to beat up on the bugs, the immune system. And then you move down the scale to the more preventive slash, lower level treatment things. And then pretty soon you don't need them anymore because you re-engage your immune system. If you stop in the middle, where most of our technology up to recent years stops, you miss the ones that are higher and nastier. So you say outside of battlefield wounds, going to hospital for surgery, who has these worse ones? Well, the easiest way to figure it out is if your patient is relatively healthy and you're treating something that is infectious but it dies pretty easy, they either have normal physiologic biofilms or they have kind of low-grade phase 1 biofilm. If you have a patient that can never get rid of their whatever, we see this in treatment-resistant SIBO, we see it in treatment-resistant parasites, you see it in treatment-resistant any other systemic infection or group of infections like Lyme complex or something. All of those people are treatment-resistant in part because they've crossed over into this more advanced biofilm world. So in those people, you need something a little different. The chemistry has to be a little different. You have to get in there and think of it this way. The physiologic ones that are normal are just, they're like a little tent. And then the phase 1 pathologic ones are sort of like someone builds maybe a plywood roof, but it's not super strong, okay? And so as long as we can find ways to kind of keep chipping away at it, the immune system will re-engage. When you get into phase 2, it's like they built a concrete bunker, literally, okay? That doesn't, stuff bounces off of that. So the goal is to know, kind of just clinically speaking, when somebody's in which phase, and if I've treated somebody with a bad one, do I do that forever? Well, no, because you don't need to. You treat them, you'll get an immune engagement all go through, and then you move backwards to the more preventive things, and then you move backwards to having them eat that stuff in their diet, and then they don't get the stuff back again. That's sort of the big story. There's one other crossover piece, which is, I think, important. I was at a completely non-biofilm oriented medical meeting. Nothing about biofilms being talked about there. And it was actually a think tank for oncology. As a kid, I always wanted to be in a think tank. You do until you're invited to one, basically. Let me just tell you that. It can be fun, but it can also be a bit of a trouble. So at a break, I'd seen this doctor a long time. And they come up and they're like, so you kind of, you're finishing up some of your oncology research, blah, blah, blah. You do anything new, what's going on? It's like, I've been playing with biofilms, trying different IV strategies, been doing all this stuff. And I said, I got good research, but it's like all over the map. It can't be really weird. And that's not unusual. So I haven't seen the guy in a while. And he says, tell me exactly like, what are you seeing that works really good? And I said, well, this and this and this, and I think this. And he says, it's crazy. And I said, well, I know, but yeah. And I said, I think I'm onto something. He goes, no, you're onto something. He says, I consult for a company that is developing these drugs for these advanced biofilms that would have military and civilian applications. So I can't tell you anything about it. But he says, we've spent millions of dollars finding out everything you just said. None of that went to me, by the way. But being a good friend, he says, look, he says, well, number one, his company it's a pharma company, and they will have patents on all of this stuff. So there's nothing I can do to infringe on that anyway. But he says, you're really close. He says that you're really close to something that will blow your mind. I just can't tell you what it is. He says, but you got most of the players. I was like, it's okay. And he says, and I'll tell you where you can look for some research and you probably can't find searching on PubMed easily. And I thought, why wouldn't I be able to find it searching on PubMed? Well, that part of the story comes later, or I won't tell you. So he gives me just a couple tips, and he says, no, really think about what you're doing, find these papers, read them, and then think about what you're doing again. And you might be amazed. And I was like, okay. So then I looked up what they were doing. And then I came back and I said, well, okay, I figured out, who you work for and all this stuff. And so you're doing this. And he says, yeah. And he says, we can't make this public because it would freak everyone out. No one wants to go to the hospital. Well, no one wants to go anyway. He says, we just want to have a solution. You go to the hospital, you're given the solution when you're unconscious, and then it's not a problem anymore. So that led me on part 2. And that's where I really started to get into research about there's these different levels and how the different therapeutics are dissimilar. And yet you only need to use certain ones at certain times. So that's really kind of the big story. And once I kind of figured out a way to find some of the references and resources, which I'm going to give you a link to a paper I wrote that has all the good ones in it so you can find them easier than I did, it cleared it up a lot. So that's really kind of the story of how we got here. Now, why is that story not in these slides? Well, partly because I'm protecting my friend, and partly because I already have enough attention from the government as it is. Sadly, that's not. It is actually funny, but it's not a joke. Now, you'll have, if you don't already, you'll have these slides, and at the end I have a link to NDNR published it as a. They didn't publish this, they published a better version of it as a paper I wrote that's a little more sequential. And so if you look, another sort of serendipitous thing happened to me, which is a very well-known medical doctor who does immunology and infectious disease on the East Coast, and I were working together. And we were both speaking about biofilms without knowing it, but the other was going to speak about it. So we both did our thing. He kind of had this whole pathology-oriented thing. We had all these slides of actual stuff he lifted out of vessels and all this. It was cool. And I kind of did my thing. We compared notes after. And then I was telling him about this story. And he said, you need to follow whatever trail the person gave you, because I used to work at the NIH, and that's where I got trained. And he says, biofilms are the CDC and the NIH's #1 target right now. And I held up the #2 for reasons that are eluding me. I think that's because there's 2 agencies, but it's their #1 target. Peace and 2 agencies. So just follow me here. And this is actually from an official person. This is the director of the NIH. Quietly, the CDC, NIH, and U.S. military declared biofilms to be one of the top dangers to human health. Huh, that comes right from the NIH director's blog. I didn't write that. Huh, these people must be onto something. All right, so you can read through all this business because you'll go to sleep. Now, one person I will tell you that you should watch is a pathologist from Arizona, Stephen Fry. I have no financial connection to him or the NIH or anybody else. Dr. Fry actually has a lab where he tests unusual organisms that are hard to test, but he's figured out ways to do it. He actually has biofilm testing and stuff. I used to do his tests. They're very good, but I only now use them for people who need to have it proven to them that they have pathogenic biofilms. Because if they've just been sick a long time, they have them. Okay, you can just assume that. But he has a really nice bibliography and stuff on his website. It's very hard to figure out. It's Fry Labs. He has all sorts of information. So if you want to read through this, and then I kind of elaborate on this in the paper that you'll see at the end there. And so you want to remember it's a group of organisms. Now here's the next thing. What is another thing outside of the thickness of the roof that makes them go from normal to a little bit pathogenic to super bad pathogenic? It's how many of them are there in the hive. And the next thing that makes them really, really nasty to deal with is they start trading DNA. So now I have a pathogenic virus, a protozoa, a bacteria, a fungus, all trading their best pathogenic DNA. And something that the more high-level people at the government say is now what you have is not all of the individual bugs. You have a hive that is a new bug. Right? It's a superbug that has shared DNA and you don't have any idea which one is doing what. Because it's all coming from this like house that they live in. That's not a rosy story, right? Because it's like, okay, I found a bacteria, I want to kill a bacteria. You don't realize that there's a protozoa trading, pathogenic information and viruses. So this is why some of the treatments have to be more broad spectrum, which we get to. So we know they're in the gut, the bloodstream. We know the teeth because that's where we found them first. Who has biofilms? Everybody has them, but not all are clinically pathogenic. Basically, if you see a positive lab titers that won't clear with standard of care, you need to think about biofilms of one kind or another. If you clear one infection and they just get another one right away, they probably didn't get the other one. The other one was probably just waiting for